My name is Jamar Buchanan, and this is the Highest and Best Man podcast.
Tell me a story about having to let go.
When I was younger, I was in a relationship where I was madly in love with this girl. And I'm talking like stuff out of the movies. We were talking about like family and kids, like this is the one, like building a family together. And it ended badly after about 5 years. And not on my terms, to be clear about that. And I spent a lot of time after things ended really trying to get that relationship back because I really was chasing that feeling or that dream that was or that I had in the relationship. And after a while of sort of like admittedly pride losing effort and time, and eventually had to just stop and let that go, despite how devastated it was to lose that. And none of my attempts worked, and I just had to move on. And while I moved on from making the attempts to regain the relationship, I really hadn't taken the time to move on from the feelings that I had and the hurt that I experienced in losing the relationship. And so while the attempts didn't persist, my behaviors after were no better because I was sort of reacting to not having that relationship in ways that weren't good for me, and I was sort of masking what I was feeling in that loss with sex or other distractions like going out or drinking and stuff like that just really wasn't healthy for me. And it was like this band-aid over the wound, if you will, versus like really sort of taking the time to treat it. And I had to just like take the hit and move on, and with my bruised ego, but I didn't have a method of processing that. I hadn't experienced anything like that. And I was very closed off to talking about it. I didn't really ever fully express it to my family, just kind of knew and figured it out. And I did talk around it with some of my friends, some of my guys at the time, but it wasn't something that I, readily shared or was definitely not proud of. And it was a trauma of sorts. Like it was no less of a trauma than, the death of a loved one, and it was loss. And not having that, taking the time to look at that and process that, or having any place to deal with that. And then the subsequent effort after that of trying to rekindle that really cost me in terms of just like my self-esteem and my confidence. And it it had a lingering effect. And I was, using the idea of sleeping with other people or going out and drinking or whatever to just really make up for that. Because like, well, if I do all of this over here, then what I thought losing that relationship meant for me can't be true, right? Like, I'm not less than or in some way inferior or whatever came up in those years. And this is over a kind of long period of time. Like I was very closed off to any other relationship for quite a while, and in doing that, I was just masking the pain, masking the pain. So at one point, I did talk to a friend of mine about the difficulty of really relating to people on that, but I never really went into any detail or connected with him on that. But it was a pretty long lasting traumatic experience for me to have lost a relationship like that.
Did you talk to any friends about this, and what was their perspective on like how women get to deal with things like this versus how men get to deal with things like this?
So I did at one point talk to a friend of mine that I've been friends with since high school. So this is like after college now. And, we were hanging out, and I just, related to him about how, it's difficult as a guy sometimes to get past stuff because you don't have as easy a relationship with some of your friends to go there on emotionally sensitive stuff. So like if something's very emotionally charged, You either suck that shit up and keep it in there, or you just act like it doesn't exist and ignore it altogether, or mask it with something else, like I was saying. So I eventually did talk to one of my friends about just like how it's really difficult and different as a guy. Sometimes women have, are seen as having these really emotional breakdowns or expressions with their friends, but they have someone to do that with, and it seems from a guy's standpoint to suck to have to go there emotionally, but not having anywhere to go with that emotion, you're still experiencing it. And so it was just like this like feeling that, well, we don't express or have connection with people for that, and it would be better if we did. And that was about as far as I was willing to go, because I still in that moment didn't really fully commit to like sort of sharing my pain and like relationship with him, even though I've known this friend of mine since we were kids in high school. And so I definitely recognized even then that there was just like a lack of place for me to put this. And I was essentially like, I wasn't calling out because I never really asked, but I was effectively almost calling out for that within my own friend group, but didn't really have a place for that or relationships built around any sort of connection like that.
Can you talk about the word trauma? Because I feel like a lot of people don't necessarily use that word often, or they're like, oh, this isn't trauma. Can you talk about trauma?
And I think a lot of times people don't use the word trauma or have a good association with it. But for me, when I say a trauma, it's something that occurs where there's a lingering effect from that event, right? Like if it's stubbing your foot on the edge of the bed rail, that's a level of trauma, right? Because it's not done once it happened. And the effect that lingers is a negative sort of harmful effect. And in my own personal opinion, I'm not a doctor or whatever, whoever decides what something qualifies as, anything for which that applies, whether it be emotional, spiritual, financial, physical, it's a trauma. It's a negative event or experience that has a lingering knock-on effect for you. And I think just like part of the difficulty and difference for guys, specifically black men, might be that in our community, where do you really pay attention to how you feel in life other than being mad, right? Like you can be pissed and you get that, you express that a lot. Lose a game, foul me, whatever, I'm mad. But like, I'm hurt. Like no one's, other than walk it off, like who addresses being harmed and hurt? Not a whole lot of people. So for me, part of my belief is that the difficulty with addressing a trauma is like identifying a trauma, because without that key part of recognizing that its lingering effect on you, how can you see it as a trauma? It could have just been an event. Like when I drop my phone, if the screen isn't broke, I don't really think there's any long lingering effect. Well, if you get broken up with and you're not present to how you feel about that and what you're doing in response to those feelings, you can't even identify your trauma, let alone respond to it and address it. So I think that trauma gets sort of swept under the rug because no one's recognizing how they feel or the effects that something is having on. When you lose your friend, right, through violence or whatever, right, like there's a trauma there because it isn't just done after the service, right? And there's trauma associated with those types of losses and impacts on you too. So anything that has that sort of lingering effect, it's important to be able to like recognize the event and thing that caused it. So just really get to the root cause of something. And then what its like ongoing effect is and why you're behaving that way, so that trauma isn't something that's impacting you for years and driving behaviors in your life. And I know that for me, that was definitely the case. I went from being a guy who was trying to marry someone and start a family with them to like dating women and just letting them know up front, I'm not looking for anything serious. Like that is a very different person. And there's a reason for that. Like I went from like, oh, happy family kid and my life is set in this relationship standpoint to like, I'm not looking for anything serious for a long time. Just telling very good people like, I'm not here for this type of connection and relationship. And that was very much my nature and who I was. So it's like, I'm shutting off part of Jamar just because there's something happening that I'm not aware of. And it's a lingering effect from a trauma of like having been in a relationship, wanting to be there, and that not working out, and the pain of that, and not wanting to ever go there again with anybody until I recognize, okay, there's something that's making me say I don't want relationships with people that I'm clearly and I'm interested in being in a relationship with.
So looking back, is there anything that you would have done differently if you look back at that like, relationship breakup?
Looking back, I would have been more just real with how things went in that relationship. If I had it to do over again, I wouldn't hide the shame of loss. I don't know. I probably did at some point tell some people in my family what happened, but I never really just cleanly said it. It was kind of the thing people figured out. If someone just stopped showing up after being around 5 years, it's like, damn, someone's only been here in a minute. It is. You have to name a thing sometimes just to like be able to deal. We got to speak it into existence and just like be able to just put it out there plainly. And I didn't do that. I was just like hiding that fact in the hopes of those efforts that it would be fixed and resolved, and that wouldn't be something that would needed to be explained or expressed ever again. But I would just like be quite frank and honest with it, and I also would just express what I felt. I wouldn't keep my feelings to myself. I would find, even if there were people in my life that didn't have space to hold those expressions for me, I'd find someone who did, whether that's a therapist or counselor, or just different friends, like people who can like take you and accept you. Like if you can be there for me when we up, is that conditional, or can you be there for me when I'm down too? Because like it's great when it's like bottles and drinks and shots at the club or what have you, but like what happens when like if my mom passed? Are you just I can't be there for you on that? Like what, if anything like that shows up. So I would make relationships where I could have that expression if I didn't have them, but I know I did. Even if it was within my family, I know they would have been there for me, and I would have just opened myself up to that and let that emotion come if it did. And like I learned this years and years after that, but it was at a time when I was crying, and I caught myself trying to like stop it, and I was like, nah, like do that, let those tears go, because it is what it is. And I came up with a quote for myself, and it's like, I'm not proud of my tears when they come, but I'm not ashamed of them either, right? Like that's not something that I need to like keep in the closet, in the back room or downstairs in the basement in the bathroom to myself as it comes out, and then come out like everything's good. I'm solid. Like, yeah, I don't have to like be like on Front Street with it too, but I don't need to like hide that part of myself. And so I would definitely just express that if I had it to do over again, emotion, as it came to me, and find places in relationships where I could do that. So if I had to do it over again, that would help me a lot. And I think that also just that point of moving on, like I would have recognized it for what it was and moved on, both, sort of in a physical sense, just accepted that loss and that relationship is no longer available, and not, swallow my pride and recognize that. But I would have moved on emotionally and allowed myself the time to heal properly versus just being reactive to shit unknowingly and then stuck in the past effectively.
What advice do you have for black men who are dealing with relationship trauma or any kind of trauma?
For black men that might be dealing with relationship trauma, the thing that I would say is, one, everybody deals with something. If you're a human being having a lived human experience, just as much a part of life, just as death is a part of life, loss is a part of it, wins, gains, are part of it. It's a whole lived human experience, and if it's all positive, how do you appreciate that, right? Like if everything is sweet, how can you appreciate savory? Like that can't be the whole experience. And so like we're probably all doing that shit. Your boy probably didn't lost, been left, cheated on, or what have you. Your other boy, the guy, he's probably, and even if he's not, like, he probably cares about you enough to like give a damn about what you're experiencing, and can like, if not sympathize, empathize with it, and just like, hey, that sounds tough, and if that happened to me, like, damn dog, I want to know. So like everybody ain't, I don't even want to say perfect, because that makes it sound like something's wrong with someone who's in an emotional state. Everyone's not having a seamless life experience, right? You can have a moment of weakness and vulnerability, and that doesn't necessarily change who you are for the lesser. I've seen guys who I've seen go there on some shit, and I've been like, yo, your willingness to have the balls to just say something that ain't cool as like, oh, I dunked on something, like, or whatever, right? Like, your willingness and ability to say something about yourself that isn't necessarily a positive thing, and the courage to do that, it speaks volumes, to me at least. It speaks volumes on who you are, because there's this confidence with self that you're showing, that I truly didn't have. I was not. I was shaken by that, and I was very uncomfortable, and like I lacked confidence. I was afraid of the truth and people finding it out. And that's a weak person, right? Like, I'm not afraid to say it now because I can look at myself and say, like, yes, I was weak in these ways. And this is like a moment in which I lost having pride in myself. Those weren't prideful actions of a man who's like in control of himself. And I can say that now, but I wouldn't say any of that then because it's like, for me, it was just like the worst thing to be seen in a lesser light. And I felt like those things meant that about me. And it's not a problem to have a problem in life, right? And I would say, if you don't have people like that in your life, know that there are people who you can hire, counselors, therapists, who will help you and go there with you. They will create space for you. They will be in that space without judgment and with a sympathetic understanding. And what you've experienced, someone has experienced 10 times over. What you've done, someone has done 10 times over. And I don't say that to say like, that does not mean that yours isn't problematic. I'm saying people experience these things and much worse and come back from that. And it's just a part of your life. And you can look back. I can look back and appreciate that time. I don't judge and say like, damn, I wish I'd have been better. I just look at it like, oh, that's who I was then. And I can look at it and say like, there were times in which I was an adult in which I wasn't a man. And at some point I had to become a man in that shit. And so appreciate that part about yourself, and don't look at the losses as like, oh, I'm a horrible. Like, no, you lose some, and that's just life. And running from that isn't going to help. You're more of a man. You're more of yourself and more honest and authentic if you can face that stuff and own up to it. Because the goal isn't to go from A to B in this thing without anything happening, right? It's to get through it and to live life sort of fully and freely as yourself. Living and being is who you are. If you're hiding some parts of yourself, that's a lesser version of a lived life, in my experience, or in my opinion.